There's one thing you have to know wherever you make your stand. Came from a long through line of everyday Americans.
Hello there, everyday Americans. Paul Engel here with the Constitution Study. I'm glad people can join me. I hope everyone's having. I hope everyone's doing okay. You know, the COVID-19 kind of has everybody up in arms, and I think sometimes we are overreacting. But hopefully, everyone's doing okay. Hopefully, you've had time to sit down and we can talk a little bit about state nullification. And hopefully I'll get to edit the video out and make this look a little better and then repost it from there. As always, I want to point you over to that website, constitutionstudy.com. That's where I put in everything that I'm doing here at the Constitution Study. And I've got some really exciting news. The book is finally finished. It's all written, it's edited, it's ready to go. It actually launches on May the 4th. Those Star Wars fans may recognize that as Star Wars Day. Well, it's May the 4th. Hopefully, I hope to have some pretty good sales out of that. I do have a pre-release sale going on at the website. Go to constitutionstudy.com/book for more information on the pre-release sale. And with the COVID virus and everybody kind of quarantining, I'm obviously not doing a lot of traveling to go to events, but I am still available to do events on the web, generally with better technology than what I'm dealing with here right now. I don't know what's up with Facebook. It's generally been giving me a hard time, but that is what it is. As always, also, please ask questions. One of the best things about doing this live is the ability to do some interaction with questions. So as you go through this, please ask questions. I'll do my best to answer them. They don't have to be at the exact topic on hand. If they are, that's great. But this is a time to kind of sit down and chat and talk about constitutional issues. And today, we'll have some really interesting, and that has to deal with state nullification. Now, I've been perusing the nets, and I found the latest example of state legislatures basically telling the federal government to stick within its box. So we'll talk about that as we go through. And now, if you've watched my podcast, you watch these videos for a while, you know that I love it when the states stand up to their creation. When they look at D.C. and say, no, you're not allowed to do that. Well, I've come across 3 examples I want to talk about this evening. And rather than doing 3 separate events, 3 separate videos, I thought I'd put them into one small Liberty Fest that we can enjoy during this difficult time. Now, normally I'd be sharing a video or I'd be sharing a screen showing you the text, but again, that's the part that's not working. So you have to listen to me read this. So we start off in the state of Missouri with HB 2339, a bill to repeal a section of their law and to enact in lieu thereof 2 new sections relating to state enforcement of federal regulations. You see, many people seem to forget that the states are not required to enforce federal regulations. See, first of all, federal regulations are not generally made pursuant to the Constitution. Therefore, they're not the supreme law of the land. It's up to the feds if they want to implement that. That's a whole other kettle of fish. See, Article 6, Clause 2 of the Constitution says, "This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, shall be the supreme law of the land." Now, I want to continuing on in HB 2339, it is to ensure that the powers reserved to this state under Amendment 10 of the Constitution of the United States are protected, and to ensure that the federal government does not encroach on this state's status as an independent sovereign in the federal system of governance, and federal rules and regulations shall be subject to review. And then item 2, no department or agency of this state shall enforce any rule or regulation promulgated by any federal agency within the borders of this state unless the enforcement of such regulation is approved by the General Assembly. You see, one of the most important clauses in the Constitution is the 10th Amendment. It codifies the idea that the Federalists had that the central government can only do what the Constitution specifically says it can do. You know, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. Now, since the states are the parties to this compact that we call the Constitution, it is their responsibility to make sure that their creation stays within its boundaries. Missouri HB 2339 seems designed to force state agencies to abide by both the Constitution of the state of Missouri and that of the United States by requiring the representatives of the citizens of Missouri approve any federal regulation before it is acted upon. Now, the one thing I think is missing from this legislation is any punishment or enforcement mechanism. At least I didn't see it. Now, while it may exist in other Missouri law, there just doesn't seem to be a penalty for a state official that enforces federal regulation that's not been approved by the Missouri General Assembly. Now, next we go on to Alabama. HB 123 reads, this bill would provide that federal laws, federal and state court decisions, and federal and state executive orders pertaining to the implementation or enforcement of extreme risk protection orders are void in this state. Now, I've talked several times in the recent past about the dangers and illegality of extreme risk protection orders, or ERPOs, or as they're more readily known as red flag laws. I've also documented several instances of the federal government trying to get states to enact such laws through bribery of grants for doing so. So continuing from HB 123, we read, this bill would prohibit this state, any of its agencies, and any of its political subdivisions or their agencies from accepting any federal grants that may become available for the intended purpose of implementing or enforcing extreme risk protection orders against the residents of this state. This bill would also make it a Class D felony to attempt to enforce any extreme risk protection order issued by a federal court or pursuant to federal law. You see, HB 123 from Alabama not only prohibits state and local agencies from accepting grants, bribes, in order to implement red flag laws, it also punishes them from enforcing any ERPO issued by a federal court or based on federal law. See, this bill would put some teeth behind that. It declares that attempting to enforce a federal ERPO is a Class D felony, punishable by 1 to 5 years in prison. Now, not only do I hope to see this bill become law, but I hope the people of Alabama, the people that Alabama hires to execute their laws, fully enforce this. And let's take a look over at Wyoming in HB 0118. It reads, an act relating to firearms regulations establishing the Second Amendment Preservation Act describing certain actions as infringing on the right to keep and bear arms, objecting to certain actions by the federal government, providing for the protection of specified rights, providing legislative declaration of authority, and providing for an effective date. Now, the last of these three bills I'm looking at, it comes out of, as I said, Wyoming. And once again, we see a state use its powers to protected by the 10th Amendment in order to protect their citizens. Continuing from HB 0118, quote, the limitation of federal government's powers affirmed under the 10th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Okay? The state of Wyoming respects the proper role of the federal government, but rejects the proposition that such respect requires unlimited submission. And then 3, the Wyoming legislature promotes responsible gun ownership and the proper enforcement of gun laws in existence on July 1st, 2020, but ceased to protect law-abiding gun owners in Wyoming from future infringements of their Second Amendment rights by the federal government. Now, should it become law, how would this bill protect law-abiding gun owners in Wyoming, you may ask? Well, the answer comes a little later in the law. Quote, the following federal acts, laws, executive orders, administrative orders, court orders, rules, and regulations shall be considered infringement on the people's rights to keep and bear arms as guaranteed by the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution and Article 1, Section 24 of the Wyoming Constitution within this state. Now, this bill then goes on to list a series of federal actions that would be considered a violation of both the Wyoming and United States Constitutions, including taxes, levies, fees, or stamps imposed solely on firearms, firearm accessories, or ammunition. The registration or tracking of firearms, firearms accessories, or ammunition reasonably expected to limit or discourage their purchase or ownership. Any registration or tracking of owners of firearms, firearm accessories, or ammunition reasonably expected to limit or discourage the purchase or ownership of said items, the forbidding of possession, ownership, or use of a firearm, firearm accessory, or ammunition by a law-abiding citizen, and the mass confiscation of firearms, firearm accessories, or ammunition. That's very interesting because you see what they're looking at. You have the actual firearms themselves. You have accessories. By that we mean, I would assume they mean magazines, suppressors, things like that. And actual ammunition. All of these we see states that are restricting. And I've just posted a video recently about how Congress is looking at a law that would seriously restrict all of these. Now, HB 0118 goes on, quote, all federal acts, laws, executive orders, administrative orders, court orders, rules, and regulations enacted after July 1, 2020, which infringe on the people's right to keep and bear arms as guaranteed by the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution and Article 1, Section 24 of the Wyoming Constitution, shall be objected to and litigated against by the Wyoming Attorney General on behalf of the citizens of Wyoming. See, this bill would require that the Wyoming Attorney General not only object, but litigate, sue any infringement on the right to keep and bear arms on behalf of the citizens of the state of Wyoming. In other words, do their job. Now, lastly, this bill prohibits public servants from enforcing any federal action which is still being litigated by the state's attorney general. Personally, I don't like the idea that a state objects to federal actions by submitting their state sovereignty to the will of a court that is part of the same government they are suing. Remember, federal courts are part of the federal government. So why would a state go to the federal government to sue the federal government about something the federal government did that violated a contract that was created by the state? But I guess that's a step too far. But at least this legislation is a step in the right direction. So let's face it, none of these bills are perfect. In truth, no bill is perfect. But these three examples show some movement toward restoring the balance of power our founding fathers created for us back in 1787. You see, we've been trained to the point of brainwashing to believe that the federal government is a source of all power. The federal power flows to the states, which then they exercise over their people. But when we read the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, especially the 10th Amendment, we see a very different power structure. We see we the people form governments, not the other way around. We the people are the two sovereigns in this country. We delegate some of our powers when we create constitutions that form our state governments. Those states in our name and by our authority delegated some of their powers to a central government we now call the federal government. And just like any creator, it is incumbent on us to oversee our creation and ensure they are remaining within the boundaries we created for them. Now, I am glad to see the representatives of these three states doing their job to protect the citizens of theirs. And not just from outside invasion, but from domestic infringement as well. Now, if you live in one of these states, well, please contact your representative. Encourage them to support this bill and maybe suggest changes that could make them better. Contact your governors and remind them you expect them to execute all the legally adopted laws of their state. Tell them you'll be watching them. And if they do not fulfill their oath to enforce these laws to protect your rights, well, you'll find someone else who will. See, it is time that we, the people, once again take up the mantle of a free people, and that we expend more time and effort vetting and holding accountable the people we hire to represent us than watching Netflix. See, if we continue to be more and more concerned about what's going on in social media or the tirades of the political parties than doing the work of citizens of a constitutional republic, we'll find that all the laws in the world will not protect us when our creations become the Frankenstein monsters history shows us they will become. So that was kind of interesting. I like I said, I picked three pieces of legislation from three different states. I find it interesting. They all deal with nullification, and they all talk about the 10th Amendment and how the Constitution says, listen, a power not specifically delegated to the United States remains with the states. And if it's prohibited to the states and not given to the feds, it remains with the people. They all use that legal basis. And I think that's important in any legislation. What is the authority by which this legislation is being promulgated? So let's see. Let me see if we got any questions coming in here. Yeah, it says I'm live. I love Facebook's changed something. And it's giving me pop-ups. There we go. Let's see. I have a question for Timothy. Whatever happened to that Missouri proposed legislation about not enforcing any federal law infringing on the Second Amendment? I don't know. Over the recent history, states have had a very iffy history, a iffy track record when it comes to actually standing up and enforcing their own legislation. I don't remember the Missouri one. I know Kansas did one back in 2013 where they said, any firearm or accessory manufactured in Kansas that's sold in Kansas and remains in Kansas is not subject to federal NFA. And that worked really good until the first time the ATF showed up to arrest somebody, and Sam Brownback and the state of Kansas folded like a cheap suit. So I said it's important not simply to talk to your legislatures. That's good. But talk to your governor and let them know you expect them to enforce these laws. And if they're not going to enforce these laws, you'll find someone who will. So I'm not sure what happened at Missouri. I don't remember that specific legislation. Not surprising. There's lots of legislation I deal with over time, but I don't remember that specific one. What states are doing this? Well, as I was saying, we have one out of Missouri, we have one out of Alabama, and we have one out of Wyoming that are all in process. Last I saw, they are all still being going through the legislative process. So if you live in one of those states, you have the ability to, again, hopefully get your representative to support it, maybe suggest a couple of tweaks that would make it better. Let's see. Okay, so Tony said, yeah, Missouri, and if Missouri did one about a year ago, similar to Kansas, I'm not surprised. This is the follow-through that our governments, both the state and the federal, are set up in three branches, right? So we have the legislative, which passes the law, and we have the executive, which executes the law. And it's not enough to simply pass a law. Contrary to what I hear all the time, passing a law doesn't mean anything. Well, it's not that it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean much. Passing a law merely says, we disapprove of this action, and we will assign these punishments to it. But that doesn't mean anything if you don't actually enforce that law. There's a podcast I listen to that talks about, they have what they call a recidivist report, where every episode, or almost every episode, they take some piece of news where some person with a criminal history, usually a multiple repeat offender, either gets let off easy or does very, very little time and then goes to commit crime again. Laws don't stop people. Laws tell us what is wrong and how it's going to be punished. And we need to keep that in mind. So I need to hold the executive branch at the state level accountable for enforcing those laws. And if they're not going to do it, all the laws in the world don't mean anything if we're not going to get them enforced. And they're not going to be enforced unless we make it not simply a verbal part of their job requirement, but an actual one. In other words, not merely say, yes, you must do these laws, but if you don't, you'll be fired, and then actually fire them. So let's see. More questions, please. I'm still looking for questions coming in here. I'm a little bit frazzled. It's I don't like when my videos don't start off smoothly because it kind of gets me into, going. So any other questions? Questions about this legislation, any of these pieces of legislation? Obviously, there's a lot of questions going on about COVID-19 and the quarantines and the legality of it and the constitutionality of it. If those questions come up, absolutely, I'll try to answer them. But it doesn't help when I've got Facebook changed something. It looks completely different. My system didn't want to log in. I'm still trying to see how many people are actually watching. It doesn't show me here. Questions? Yeah, okay. Are they legal? Timothy, what do you mean by they? When you talk about state nullification laws, absolutely they're legal. They go back to the 10th Amendment, which says any power not delegated to the federal government. See, this is something that we've been taught that is completely backwards. You see, we envision the power structures of feds are on top, then you have the states, then you have the local governments. That's backwards, right? The system works the other way around. Most of the power comes from us. It comes from we the people. And we delegate some power to the states when we form a state government with a constitution, right? Each state has a constitution. It establishes the state government. It establishes the rules. It establishes the structure. It establishes the boundaries of the state government. Now, the states, in our name and with our permission, took some of those powers. And again, some of those powers are like the power to make laws, the power to enforce laws, and to do things like collect taxes, establish traffic laws. When we declared independence, we actually said they had the power to make law, make war, sue for peace, conduct foreign commerce. These were all powers that the states had. Now, when they formed the federal government, the states got together and they made a contract. They made a compact that we call the Constitution. And they said, okay, we're going to take some of our power. We're going to take the power to declare war and sue for peace and to coin money and deal with foreign commerce and even interstate commerce. And we're going to take that and we're going to give that to the federal government. See, the federal government is a creation of the states, not the other way around. Growing up in America, we tend to think of states as subdivisions of the federal government. That is not true. The states existed before the federal government. The state existed before the United States, the Union of States did. They formed that union and they created the federal government, and therefore they are in charge of the federal government. Now wrap your head around that for just a minute. The states are in charge of the federal government. Now, a lot of people get twisted around the axle when they look at Article 6, Clause 2, because it says, oh, well, federal law, the Constitution and laws of the United States are supreme. Except that's not exactly what it says. It says this Constitution and the laws of the United States made pursuant thereof. In other words, if the Congress of the United States passes a law that is pursuant, that fulfills its role within the Constitution, well, then it's supreme. So when the federal government makes a law that is within its delegated powers, for example, Congress has the authority to, it's April, right? So they have the authority under the 16th Amendment to collect taxes directly from the people based on income. So when Congress passes a law that says, okay, here's the income tax rate and here's how we're going to do that, that's all within the power of the federal government. It is delegated to them by the Constitution. Therefore, that is a legitimate law. Therefore, it's done pursuant to the Constitution. It's the supreme law of the land. However, when Congress passes a law and says, you know what, there are certain arms we do not believe people should be able to keep and bear. Or when Congress comes in and says, we think there should be rules about education, about health care, about a myriad of other things that are not within a power delegated to the federal government, that law is not made pursuant to the Constitution. That law is made in violation of the Constitution. And if you read Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 78, he says those laws mean nothing. It means nothing. Actually, it's also Madison in 68, I think. What's interesting is law students are taught that there's an early Supreme Court case called Marberry versus Madison, where the court assumed the power of judicial review, where the court gets to determine what the federal government can do. Well, first of all, that's not what the court opinion said. I've actually read it. Two, that is in itself a violation of the Constitution. So when a state looks at what the federal government is doing and says, no, that is beyond the power we've delegated to you, that has no sway within the borders of the state. And that's the important distinction, right? So the state is not saying, okay, all of these taxes and levies and stamps that you're doing, they're unconstitutional and they have no effect in the country. They're not saying that. These states are saying that is a violation of the compact. Therefore, we are not going to allow you to enforce those within our state. We won't help you do it. We won't pay to do it. And in some cases, they've even said, if the federal government tries to do it, we will arrest them. Now, none of these never said arrest. Was Alabama, I think, said, was Alabama or Wyoming that said the Attorney General would sue them. But where's the Attorney General going to sue them? They have to sue them in federal court. So I said, you're suing the federal government with the federal government. So yes, these laws are perfectly legal because they're following the supreme law of the land and they're holding the federal government accountable. And the more and more the American people realize that the states have the power to nullify within their bounds the federal government. Now, what would be better is if the American people started hiring representatives and both us and the states who actually followed the Constitution in the first place. But that's going to take a lot of education. That's going to take time. So this is a stopgap. So coronavirus and quarantine cities making laws. Well, Christopher, yeah, I've seen a lot of questions about this, and here's the thing, and as I said, we have the states are created with a state constitution, meaning the people of that state gave their state government certain powers. Now, I don't study and research all of the constitutions of all of the states. So if a state in their constitution has given the authority to establish quarantines, that is a function that again, it's a state matter that the state may have allowed through the state constitution. Now, the area where I think that would be a problem is if you're quarantining someone, if you're doing a blanket quarantine, meaning, let's say I get tested, or I have a good reason to believe, I've just come from overseas, or some other thing that says, hey, I may have been exposed to COVID-19, and the state says, okay, yeah, we're going to put you into quarantine until you either test negative or whatever the quarantine length is to make sure you don't have the virus, because we're concerned based on something you've done. That's a little iffy. Again, it depends on how the quarantine is done. If we're asking you to self-quarantine, we're saying, please stay in your home, don't go to work and all that, fine. We're not going to lock you up. We just want you to stay at home because we're concerned until you've tested negative. If someone tests positive, I have a friend of mine, he and his wife have tested positive for COVID-19. They're quarantined in their home. They have self-quarantined. In other words, they've recognized that they could potentially be a danger to their friends and neighbors, so they're not associating with them. That's part of the responsibility of living in a free constitutional republic is, okay, yes, I could go out and do things, but that would be a danger to others, so I'm going to restrain myself because I don't want to be a danger to others. The state is not locking them up. They have self-quarantined. Now, the situations that I've heard of, and again, I don't always trust the veracity of some of these reports of people who have COVID-19, know they have COVID-19, and are still out and about and endangering others. Now they are violating the rights of the other citizens. Then the state has the authority to say, okay, we're going to force you to quarantine. If you won't quarantine yourself, we have to force you because you are a beyond a reasonable doubt threat, right? Beyond reasonable doubt. You have probable cause that you are a threat to others, so we can issue a warrant and have you restrained if you won't restrain yourself. That's the way everything should work. But when they turn around and say, everybody stay home, and I'm going to use the example of New York City. Now, New York City is kind of unique. New York City, I used to live in New York City. It's a very crowded place. If you've never been to New York City, you can't live without being in contact with people. You're always in touch with people. You're in touch with stuff people have touched. It is a perfect breeding ground for the spread of this type of virus. So they have a problem. It's spreading like wildfire. The issue we run into is, okay, as reasonable adults, shouldn't we be quarantining ourselves? Why are we expecting the government to tell us we must quarantine? Now, I don't live in New York City anymore. I live out in the middle of nowhere. But I'm still not completely quarantined, but I have limited my contact. In other words, if we should be free to make decisions, rational decisions based on our concerns, right? If I'm in a position where I've worked from home for decades, working from home is no big deal for me. If I worked in a job where that wasn't a possibility and it was a choice between finding a way to work and still socially distance myself or feeding my family, that's a big deal. That's a decision we should be making. I think the issue when we're dealing with cities and states and these, again, I don't know all the details of the state constitutions and what powers they have given their government, those citizens have given their government in an emergency. But as a general rule, unless someone is a probable cause of a threat, I don't think the government should be forcing them to quarantine, certainly not arresting them. But on the other hand, we have to take responsibility and say, you know what, it's probably a good idea to not hang out with a bunch of people, especially if you think you may have been infected. I have another friend who believes it's possible they were in contact with somebody and they may have been exposed. They voluntarily, they just stay home. They don't meet us at church. We don't go out. This is before everything was shut down. They don't do that. And the problem, the biggest concern I have is, well, it's probably twofold. One is, it's like the American people have lost the ability to reason for themselves, to look at this and say, you know what, I'm not going to expose myself and my family. I'm going to do whatever I can to protect myself. And we would naturally socially distance. We're waiting for people are waiting for the government to tell them to do these things, which is infantile, in my opinion. The other is, I see a lot of people taking this as an opportunity to assume powers they don't have under the guise of, well, we've got to save you can't, we have to decide whether or not, the government has to decide whether or not this business is essential or not. Why? Where does the government get the authority to determine what is an essential business or not? What is essential to you and what is essential to me may be two different things. We've become so dependent on government to tell us what to do that we're now letting the government rule our lives and take over powers they don't really have. So when it comes specifically to cities and states and the laws they're passing, you'd have to go in and research that state's constitution, the limit to the power that they are given under an emergency. I know they're generally more than are given to the federal government because there is no national emergency clause in the federal constitution. So it's a long one, but I think it's, to me, it's not simply a question of, quarantine, yes or no. I think a lot of places have had, the states have issued quarantines and the cities have issued quarantines in part because the people have not been taking care of themselves, taking responsibility and saying, maybe we should stop associating. And as always, they're ham-handed, they're overdoing it, and they're actually causing a lot of problems that I think the next 12 to 18 months are gonna be really, really difficult, where the cure is gonna cause a lot of pain and the cure is gonna cause a lot of death as we see people who can't provide for themselves and a lot of follow-on issues because we've got this one-size-fits-all mentality. So that's Christopher, I hope that answers your question. Let's see, what else we got here? In Hawaii, let's see, RC, in Hawaii, they're issuing citations for violation of stay-at-home orders from the governor, which carries up to a $5,000 fine up to 1 year in jail as a misdemeanor offense. How can it be a misdemeanor offense when it is a governor's order and not a law? Good point. And the governor has no authority, even in an emergency under Hawaii law, to pass them. Again, everything has to start with the Hawaiian Constitution. Right? Now, if the Hawaiian Constitution gives emergency powers to the governor to issue orders and those under a certain law, and this is a little convoluted, but stay with me. So let's say the Hawaiian Constitution, and I'm not sure if this is the case. I haven't studied the Hawaiian Constitution, but let's say the Hawaiian Constitution says the governor can issue a state of emergency, and in that state of emergency, under law XYZ, he can do these things with this penalty. That's the tricky question. In other words, is the law that allows the governor to declare an emergency give him the power to establish rules that would fall within the realm of a misdemeanor under that law? Maybe look at it the other way. Under what law did the governor issue the emergency? That's the first place to look, right? If the governor issued an emergency under, the Hawaiian Emergency, the Declaration of Emergency Act, well, then you have to look at that law and see the breadth of the power that the governor has under that situation. The step that we really should take, though, is does the legislature of the state of Hawaii have the authority to pass that law? I don't know. And that's worth a little research. And RC, it's we're a bit of the problem is, where do you go for redress of your grievance? See, if you're fined by the state of Hawaii under a law passed by the state of Hawaii, which may not be valid under the Constitution of the state of Hawaii, you have to go to a court that is part of the very same government you're suing. It's kind of why getting the courts to deal with things are a real problem. We need to deal with them beforehand, and it's worth, if RC, I'm assuming you're a resident of Hawaii or know someone who's a resident of Hawaii, it's worth researching, and it's worth then going to the representatives going, wait a second, this is not within your constitutional authority. Here's the evidence, and you swore an oath. You got to remember, every legislator, every governor, every member of the executive branch of the state swore or affirmed to support not only the Constitution of their state, but of the United States. Ours is on not giving any authority from the legislative branch. The legislature has the authority to pass it, but not the governor. So the question is, and again, the devil's in the details, right? Is only the Hawaiian legislature authorized to declare an emergency or not? Or is it the governor authorized to do that? Has the legislature of Hawaii said, yes, we have the authority to do this, but we're going to delegate it to the governor? Well, that's a whole nother kettle of fish, because they may not have the authority to actually delegate it to the governor. But it's part of the problem. See, I'll tell you a little story. I saw this on a video and I couldn't believe it. I had to do a little research and I found out it was pretty true. You've all heard of the game Monopoly, right? Many of us probably played the game Monopoly. Ask yourself, have you ever actually stopped and read the directions for the game of Monopoly? Or did you simply learn it when you started playing it? You see, Parker Brothers, the company that makes Monopoly, they were getting a lot of questions on their helpline about how the game is played, and they decided to do a survey, and they commissioned a survey, and they found that something like 40% of people surveyed, they've played Monopoly, but they've never actually read the directions. They're playing the game based on how they were told it was played. And we kind of treat our governments the same way. In other words, most people never read the directions. So we start playing a game, the game of life, putting it for another game, the game of governing without actually knowing the rules. We kind of learn them as they go. So I would not be surprised if even the people in the legislature in Hawaii have not read and studied their own constitution, know what their powers are. If you're never held accountable, if no one ever stands up and says, wait a second, you're not allowed to do that. If you do that, we will fire you. What do they care? We're back to laws, right? What good are rules if nobody bothers to follow them? It's one of the reasons why, whatever else we talk about doing, I think it's important that the American people, all the American people, learn the Constitution of the United States and of their state so that they know what the rules are, so that they can vet their representatives, vet their agents, hold them accountable, fire them if they don't follow it. But that's going to take time. And it's not sexy. You know, it's really cool to say, oh, well, we should pass an amendment, or we should do this, or we should do that. It's really not sexy. Yeah, we should educate the American people. But I think it's the bedrock, it's the foundation from which we restore the liberty of a constitutional republic. Let's see. The governor can declare an emergency, yet a declaration of emergency doesn't take any of the powers from the legislature and transfer them to the government. I'm assuming you mean governor during the emergency. Declaring an emergency makes it easier for the governor to move funds around and to enact different agencies to work through the emergency. So that's, again, if you're right, again, I haven't studied the Hawaiian Constitution, but it's not surprising. I mean, how often do we see executive orders doing things that are not authorized? That's what the governor's done. He's issued an executive order and said, we're going to put a fine on this. Like I said, I'd love to see someone sue. I'd love to see someone in court saying, excuse me, show me where the governor has the authority to do this. But we're back to the same catch-22. The person judging whether or not that suit has merit works for the very same government you're trying to sue. We need to turn back and, I believe if enough people in the state of Hawaii understood the limitations of what a governor can do under an order and stood up and said, excuse me, sir, madam, I don't know who the governor of Hawaii is. You're not authorized to do that. You're breaking the law. You're usurping powers. And we're not going to stand for it. And either you stop it or come next election, we'll find someone who'll follow the law. Ultimately, that's where our power rests. We have to vote for these people. The more people we get to understand just how dangerous these orders are, the more we get people to recognize how much their liberty is at stake, then and what the logical outcome is of letting these things stand. If someone says, well, this is an emergency, and we have to do something. My answer to that is always, you know what, you're right, you have to do something. But my question is, if you are in a car, if you're in the Titanic and you're heading for that iceberg, you have to do something. Now you can either turn or you can put more throttle. The answer is not to put more throttle. The answer is not to continue doing the same things if what you're doing is going to get you killed. Sure, this is an emergency, and under this situation, people should be separated. What happens when there's another emergency? Only this isn't a virus. This is fake news. What happens when this isn't a virus? What happens when this is a natural disaster? There's a typhoon in Hawaii. And they say, you know what? For your own safety, we're going to violate your rights for your own safety because we know better. Oh, we don't have the authority to do it. It's not legal or anything, but we're going to make it seem legal because we're going to pass a law and we're going to do that. See, that's the part that we have to start talking about. Going, if the governor can fine you $5,000 for stepping outside because he doesn't want you spreading a virus, what happens when he says you will be gathered up into a center for protection from a storm, and if not, we'll be fined $5,000? And think about Hurricane Katrina and the people that went into the Superdome. Imagine if it wasn't voluntary. Imagine if the governor came along and said, everybody must collect in these shelters for your own safety, and if we find you outside, we're going to fine you $5,000. What happens when it's not a storm? What happens when it's, well, all of these people we're going to collect into camps because we think they are a threat to national security? The Japanese in the 1940s. You see, we have to stop focusing. Yes, there's an important details there, but we have to educate, not just on the unimportant details. We have to educate on the logical outcomes, because if the governor can fine you $5,000 for being outside in a virus pandemic, what's to stop them from doing it in a typhoon, in a hurricane, or just because of some other reason of national security? What happens? Let's see. Tom says this emergency is a litmus test to see how far. Well, every emergency. I mean, let's face it. Hopefully we've all heard, right? Never let a crisis go to waste. This is the logical outcome. Why do you think they were able to pass a $2.2 trillion spending bill that put, at last number I saw, about $750 billion of money to actually deal with the virus? They paid they wanted to have $750 billion for the American people and for businesses, and they're going to spend $2.2 trillion to do that. Why? Because it's an emergency, and we have to do something. And if you dare to get in the way and say, what does funding the National Endowment, what does funding the Kennedy Center have to do with a worldwide pandemic? Well, you just want people to die. No. I see people who, if somebody falls overboard, I want to throw them a life preserver. I do not want to attach an anchor to that life preserver. But when people get scared, they stop thinking. And that's what we see, right? The COVID-19, yeah, it's a bad bug. To my knowledge, it still is not as bad, is not been as dangerous as the seasonal flu. Now, I'm no epidemiologist. And I know there are things that we should do in order to protect ourselves. But like any other time, an emergency is simply another way of saying, let's get people to give over our stuff because we're going to scare them, and they'll give away their liberties because they stop thinking. There's a great book by Michael Crichton called State of Fear. It has nothing to do with pandemics. It has nothing to do with anything that's going on today, but it's an excellent example of how people use fear, governments use fear to manipulate people. So let's say the next virus hits in the next election cycle. Timothy, I love it. So let's say the next virus hits in the next election cycle. Let's say the virus only affects women. Can the government say women cannot vote in the election? It's a humorous. I hope you meant it as a humorous. It's a humorous thing because it misses. It's an exaggeration that hopefully should make the point. You see, rights are rights. You have a right regardless. An emergency doesn't mean you give up your rights. Emergencies are used to scare people to giving up their rights, but no, it doesn't. Now, what it does mean is that a government should they should make preparations, right? If let's say this goes on into the fall, what are we going to do about the election? Well, they should be making preparations, and the people who the government work for should be making sure their representatives are looking into that. But it's the same scenario of it's the hyperbole that's meant to point out the fallacy of the argument. Let's see, back to Tom. The death toll in the United States 2017-18 flu was 62,000 people. 17-18. I'm not sure of that number, Tom. Again, I've seen a lot of different numbers, and I've seen them not always presented very well. The last number I saw is the CDC expected the 2018-19 seasonal flu to kill between 20 and 40,000 Americans. And I don't know what the latest number is because I refuse to get caught up in the hype and the fear of what's going on. Is COVID-19 dangerous? Yes, especially if you're older or if your health or your respiratory system is compromised. It is much more dangerous to them than to everybody else. The problem I have is when we make this one-size-fits-all solution, we're taking the people that need help and we're throwing them a life preserver with an anchor tied around it because we're crippling the rest of the nation in order to save these people. Now, I want to save these people. My wife is immunocompromised. We take precautions. But that doesn't mean I expect the entire world to stop simply because I don't want something bad to happen to my wife. It means we take precautions. And I have no problem with the stores being open, and I have no problem. I was out shopping yesterday, and Walmart, they have a line, and they have marks, so the people are standing 6 feet apart, and they're only letting so many people in a time at the store so that they don't get all crowded and congested. Okay, seems a reasonable precaution being done by a private entity to deal with their store, not simply to protect their customers, but also their employees. But yeah, this has been it is not a binary situation. It is not everything is safe or everything's a disaster. We have to grow up enough to say, I know the risks, I know the costs. Let me decide how best to deal with that, because the answer is different. Who was it? There was a governor that I'm trying to remember. I saw this article and I'm drawing a blank on it, but I want to say Governor Nemo, who maybe it was New Mexico, refused to implement some CDC recommendation, and she was vilified for it. I'm like, New Mexico is not New York City. The needs of New Mexico are different from New York City. The dangers in New Mexico are different than New York City. Let New Mexico do what is best for New Mexico. Let New York City do what's best for New York City, and let the people of those locales determine whether or not the people they hire as their agents are doing a good job or not. Those would get one of my favorite quotes from Ben Franklin. Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. I have a plan. One of the things I wanted to do this year, I'm still trying to do, is I want to have merchandise. I want to get like T-shirts, and I'll have T-shirts made up where I've got a portrait of a founding father and a quote from them, and that is one of the first ones on there. It's Benjamin Franklin, and it's true. It's understanding. The thing about rights and liberty, true liberty means I restrain myself to avoid harming others. It's not other people. Liberty is not other people restraining me. It's I restrain myself in order to not harm others. That's true liberty. And I've got a whole class I do on liberty. If you want, the Constitution Scholar Program is going to be opening up soon, and actually, it's technically open. You can get it if you pre-order the book, but I have a whole class where I talk about rights and liberties and all that. But you're right. It's we never stop to think of the cost. What is the cost of letting the federal government spend money like that would make a drunken sailor puke, allowing the states and the cities to run roughshod over our liberties, because if they'll do it now, what's to stop them from doing it again later? I have an audio ground hum in my audio feed. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm not sure what's going on. The system I normally use isn't working, and it may be I don't know if it's the app. Tom, you're welcome. I'm glad to do this. I apologize for the quality. I'll go back and figure out what happened with the software. It worked fine before. But I have to figure out why it wouldn't talk to Facebook. So hopefully next month there'll be a I'll have all the pretty background, and I'll have all the quotes up for you for next month. What I'll do is I have a secondary recording of this video. I will edit it and upload it so that you get you can have access to it as well. But the only difference is, rather than putting the whole video up on Facebook, I'll probably just put a highlight reel up, and you can click the link, go to my website, and see the entire thing with all the quotes. I want to thank everybody that took the time out of their day. Maybe you're quarantining, maybe you're socially isolating, maybe you're just enjoying a little time away from the office. Whatever the answer is, thank you for spending a little bit of time with me today. Head over to the website, constitutionstudy.com. Let me know what you think. I will continue to answer questions as they pop up. Probably start working on them tomorrow. Please, if you're interested in the book, came out really, really well. I really like it. Go to constitutionstudy.com/book. I'm offering it on sale. I've got it's like 40% off. If you order the book before it goes to print on the 4th, May 4th, you're getting like 40% off. And I've also got a an ebook edition that you can get for like $5 more, that you can download today and start reading it. All that's on constitutionstudy.com/book. If you have any contacts in the media, I have a media kit. I'm trying to get a press release out to get more interest, to share this with more people. So share what you can, share these videos. Thank you for all the help. Thank you for all the support. And I'll catch you again the next time on the Constitution Study. Thanks, everyone.
There's one thing you have to know wherever you make your stand. Came from